Hi, everyone. The U.S. president received a lesson in economic reality. He turned to Russia with an unprecedented demand to resume the supply of enriched uranium for American nuclear power plants. The reason is simple. The U.S. is critically dependent on Russian nuclear fuel. About 35 to 40% of enriched uranium for American nuclear power plants comes from Russia. Without these supplies, more than 90 reactors, providing almost 20% of U.S. electricity, will be at risk of shutdown. But Putin's response shocked the entire West. Russia refused harshly, unequivocally, without the possibility of bargaining. I quote a Kremlin representative, "For years, the United States has imposed sanctions against Russia, tried to strangle our economy, seized our assets, arrested our citizens. Now they are asking us to save their energy sector. The answer? No. Solve your problems yourselves. Washington is in panic. Without Russian uranium, the American nuclear energy sector will face a catastrophe. There are not enough alternative suppliers. Creating their own facilities will take years and require tens of billions of dollars. Trump wanted to get uranium, but got damage to the entire American economy. Today, we will analyze the entire chain of events, from the energy crisis in the United States to Trump's brazen demand and Putin's tough refusal. Find out the technical details of the American energy sector's dependence on Russian nuclear fuel, and most importantly, understand the scale of the economic damage that the United States will suffer without Russian uranium, and how this will change the balance of power in the world. Stay until the end, because in the finale, I will show you a map of American nuclear power plants dependent on Russian supplies, and explain why Europe will also suffer from the Russian refusal. And secondly, we will analyze why nuclear energy has become the Achilles' heel of the entire Western strategy against Russia. Let's start with a technical context. The U.S. nuclear energy sector is based on 93 power reactors, located at 56 nuclear power plants in 30 states. These reactors produce about 18 to 19% of all U.S. electricity. This is approximately 800 billion kilowatts per year. For the operation of these reactors, nuclear fuel, enriched uranium, is needed. Natural uranium contains only about 7% of the isotope uranium-235, which is necessary to maintain a nuclear reaction. For use in reactors, uranium needs to be enriched to 3 to 5% uranium-235 content. The process of uranium enrichment is complex, expensive, requires high technologies, and huge energy consumption. There are a limited number of countries and companies in the world that have the capacity to enrich uranium on an industrial scale. Russia, through the state corporation Rosatom, is the world's largest producer of enriched uranium, controlling about 40% of the global enrichment services market. The United States has its own uranium enrichment facilities, but they only cover about half of the national needs. The rest is imported, and the main supplier is Russia. About 35 to 40% of enriched uranium for American nuclear power plants comes from Russia. Why is this important? Because without Russian supplies, the American nuclear energy sector cannot function to its full extent. It is possible to redistribute fuel between reactors. It is possible to extend the operating cycles on existing loads. But within a year or a year and a half, reactors will start shutting down without Russian uranium. And each stopped reactor is a loss of gigawatts of power, billions of dollars in losses, and a shortage of electricity. What does this change? This makes the United States vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail. Just as Europe was vulnerable to Russian gas, the United States is vulnerable to Russian uranium. And this vulnerability is now being used by Moscow as a geopolitical weapon. Let's analyze how this dependence arose. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia inherited colossal uranium enrichment capacities, created for the Soviet nuclear program. These capacities significantly exceeded Russia's own needs, and Rosatom began to actively export uranium enrichment services. The United States, seeking to reduce costs, began to purchase Russian-enriched uranium. It was cheaper than maintaining and expanding their own facilities. American nuclear power plant operators bought Russian fuel through various contracts, often long-term, for 5 to 10 years ahead. Additionally, there was the HEU-LEU program, highly enriched uranium, low-enriched uranium, under which Russia diluted weapons-grade uranium from dismantled nuclear warheads to a level suitable for use in power reactors and supplied it to the United States. This program ran from 1993 to 2013 and provided the United States with significant volumes of cheap nuclear fuel. When the HEU-LEU program ended, the U.S. dependence on Russian commercial supplies of enriched uranium only increased. By the 2020s, Russia had become virtually an indispensable supplier for the American nuclear energy sector. Attempts by the United States to diversify supplies were hampered by restrictions. Alternative suppliers, the European consortium Eurenco, the French company Orano, formerly Areva, the Chinese CNNC, have limited capacities and cannot fully replace Russian supplies. In addition, their services are more expensive. The U.S.'s own uranium enrichment capacities are concentrated mainly at one enterprise, the Centrus Energy Plant in Piketon, Ohio. Its capacity is not sufficient to cover all national needs. The construction of new uranium enrichment plants requires many years and huge investments, tens of billions of dollars. Thus, the United States found itself in a situation of strategic dependence on Russia in a critically important area: nuclear energy. Write in the comments if you knew before about the U.S. dependence on Russian uranium, because this topic was carefully hushed up by the American media. Now about Trump's demand. The U.S. president held a meeting with the Minister of Energy and the heads of the largest energy companies. The topic was the threat of a shortage of nuclear fuel for American nuclear power plants. According to experts, without Russian supplies, by the end of 2026, about 2030 American reactors will be left without fuel and will be forced to shut down. Trump, known for his pragmatism, decided to turn to Russia with a proposal to resume uranium supplies. After the meeting, the White House issued a statement. President Trump instructed the Minister of Energy to begin negotiations with the Russian side on the resumption of contracts for the supply of enriched uranium. This is in the interests of U.S. energy security and the stability of the global nuclear fuel market. The wording is cautious, but the essence is clear. The United States is asking Russia to save its nuclear energy sector, and this is after many years of sanctions, confiscation of Russian assets, seizure of Russian tankers, and attempts to strangle the Russian economy. The Russian side received the American appeal and forwarded it to President Putin for consideration. On January 20th, a response followed that shocked Washington. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov issued a statement. The Russian Federation has considered the appeal of the American side regarding the supply of nuclear fuel. President Putin has decided to refuse. For years, the United States has pursued a hostile policy towards Russia, imposed sanctions, tried to strangle our economy, seized our assets worth trillions of dollars, and arrested our citizens. Now they are turning to us with a request to save their energy sector. The answer is unequivocal: no. The United States must solve its problems independently, without the help of a country that they have declared an enemy. Then comes the key phrase. Russia will not supply strategically important resources to a state that is in a state of economic and political war with us. If the United States wants Russian uranium, let them first revise their policy, lift sanctions, return the seized assets, release the detained Russian citizens, and stop supporting Ukraine. Then we are ready to discuss the resumption of commercial relations. This is not just a refusal, it is an ultimatum. Russia sets conditions. If you want our uranium, change your entire policy. No partial concessions, no compromises. Either complete capitulation in the economic war or stay without uranium. Why is this important? Because Russia is demonstrating that it has levers of pressure on the United States that Washington did not take into account. America thought that it would strangle Russia with sanctions and it would remain invulnerable. Now it turns out that the United States is vulnerable, and very seriously. What does this change? This turns the balance in the economic war. Previously, the initiative was with the United States. They imposed sanctions. Russia tried to adapt. Now the initiative is with Russia. It controls a resource that is critical for the United States and dictates the conditions. Let's analyze the consequences for the American energy sector. Without Russian uranium, the United States will face a cascading crisis. Short-term consequences, 6 to 12 months. Redistribution of existing fuel reserves between reactors. Prioritizing the most critical stations. Extending operating cycles on existing fuel loads. Medium-term consequences, 1 to 2 years. The beginning of reactor shutdowns due to lack of fuel. According to experts, without Russian supplies, 20-30 reactors will be shut down by the end of 2027. This is a loss of about 20-30 gigawatt of installed capacity, a shortage of electricity, rising prices, and blackouts in certain regions. Long-term consequences, 3 to 5 years. If the United States does not find alternative suppliers or create its own facilities, all reactors dependent on Russian uranium will be at risk of shutdown. This is about 30 to 40 out of 93. Loss of a third of nuclear generation, which accounts for about 6-7% of all U.S. electricity. The economic damage is estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars. Losses for nuclear power plant operators from reactor shutdowns. Costs for purchasing alternative fuel at inflated prices. Investments in the construction of their own uranium enrichment facilities, and rising electricity prices for consumers. Strategic damage, undermining the reputation of the United States as a reliable partner in the field of nuclear energy. If America cannot provide fuel for its own reactors, how can it guarantee fuel for the reactors that it sells to other countries? The alternatives are limited. Increasing purchases from other suppliers, Urenco, Orano, CNNC. Problems. Their capacity is limited, prices are higher, delivery times are extended. They will not be able to completely replace Russian supplies. Construction of their own uranium enrichment facilities. Problem. Time. At least 5 to 7 years from the start of design to launch. Cost. Tens of billions of dollars. Technological difficulties. The United States has lost many competencies in this area over the years of dependence on imports. Transitioning part of the reactors to alternative types of fuel. Problem. Requires retrofitting reactors, lengthy licensing procedures, and huge costs. Realistic only in the long term. None of the alternatives solves the problem quickly. The United States is doomed to a multi-year nuclear energy crisis. Write whether you think Putin's decision to refuse to supply the U.S. with uranium is correct, or whether this is an excessive escalation of the economic war. Now about Washington's reaction. Russia's refusal caused shock in American political and business circles. The Minister of Energy issued a statement calling Russia's actions nuclear blackmail and a threat to U.S. energy security. Congress held emergency hearings to discuss response options. Trump is furious. According to sources in the White House, the president did not expect such a harsh refusal. He hoped that Russia would meet them halfway for commercial reasons. Uranium sales bring Rosatom billions of dollars a year. Giving up such a market is a significant blow to the Russian economy. But Putin chose geopolitics over commerce. Russia is ready to sacrifice income from uranium sales to the United States for the sake of a strategic advantage, demonstrating America's vulnerability and pressuring it to change American policy. In Congress, there are calls for retaliatory measures. New sanctions against Rosatom, attempts to block Russian uranium supplies to third countries, pressure on alternative suppliers so that they do not increase supplies to Russia. But everyone understands that these are empty threats. Russia is already under thousands of sanctions. Additional ones will change little. The United States cannot block Rosatom's supplies to third countries. It is the sovereign right of each country to choose suppliers. Alternative suppliers will not refuse profitable contracts because of American pressure. The United States is in a trap. They themselves created this situation, increasing their dependence on Russian uranium for years in order to save costs. Now the price. Let's analyze the consequences for Europe. The European nuclear energy sector is also dependent on Russian uranium, although to a lesser extent than the American one. About 20 to 25% of enriched uranium for European nuclear power plants comes from Russia. If Moscow decides to extend the refusal to Europe as well, the European energy sector will face serious problems. France, with 56 energy reactors producing about 70% of the country's electricity, is particularly vulnerable. Without Russian uranium, some of the French reactors will have to be shut down. Eastern Europe is even more dependent. Reactors of Soviet design in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria were originally designed for Russian fuel. Switching to alternative types of fuel is complex and expensive. Russia has not yet announced restrictions on supplies to Europe, but the hint is clear. If Europe continues its hostile policy, if there are new sanctions, if support for Ukraine increases, Russian uranium can be used as a weapon of pressure. European countries are faced with a choice: continue the anti-Russian policy and risk energy security, or distance themselves from the United States and establish relations with Russia for access to resources. This creates a split in the Western Bloc. The United States demands solidarity. Europe is thinking about its own survival. Unity is cracking. Now about the strategic importance of Russian control over the uranium market. Russia has a complete nuclear fuel cycle, from uranium ore mining to enrichment, fuel production, reactor construction, and spent fuel reprocessing. This makes Russia an indispensable player in the global nuclear energy market. Rosatom is building nuclear power plants in dozens of countries around the world: Turkey, Egypt, Bangladesh, India, and China. These reactors will require Russian fuel throughout their service life, 30 to 40 years. These are long-term contracts, long-term dependence, long-term influence of Russia. By refusing to supply the U.S. with uranium, Russia is demonstrating to the whole world: we control a critically important resource and can use it as a geopolitical weapon. Countries friendly to Russia will receive reliable supplies. Hostile countries will be left without them. This reverses the logic of the energy war. The West tried to use its control over finance, technology, and logistics to strangle Russia. Russia responds: we control the resources, gas, oil, uranium, metals, without which your economy does not work, and we will not sell them to enemies. We are witnessing the formation of a new world order, where control over resources is more important than control over finance. Dollars can be printed, technologies can be developed, but uranium, gas, and oil cannot be created out of thin air. Whoever has the resources has the power. Russia understands this and uses it. The refusal to supply uranium to the United States is a demonstration of a new reality. Follow the developments. This is not the last word in the energy war. The United States will look for ways to circumvent the Russian refusal. Russia may extend the restrictions to other countries. Europe will waver between Washington and Moscow. But one thing is clear: Trump received a harsh lesson. You cannot wage economic war with Russia for years and then ask it for help. Russia remembers everything: sanctions, asset seizures, arrested citizens, and now it is paying back in the same coin. Trump wanted uranium, but got damage. Damage to the American energy sector, damage to the economy, damage to prestige. Russia has shown that it has a weapon that hits hard and accurately, and this weapon is control over resources. And now write in the comments: do you think Trump will surrender and fulfill Russia's conditions for the resumption of uranium supplies? Or will the United States try to somehow circumvent the problem on its own? Because the future of not only the American energy sector, but also the entire system of global economic relations depends on this choice. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for staying until the end. Trump brazenly demanded Russian uranium. Putin refused harshly. America is without fuel for nuclear power plants. Russia is demonstrating strength. The energy war is entering a new level. Damage instead of uranium. An accurate formulation of what the United States received. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. The world is changing. Resources are becoming weapons. And Russia has enough of this weapon.